Welcome back. In our last video for chapter 4, we want to talk about the causes of inflation. So really think about, why we get periods where prices are going up for, 6 months, a year, 2 years, sometimes even longer. And then also why prices come back down, which can be a more complicated topic. So we're going to use our wage setting, price setting model, but we're going to add in our aggregate demand model to sort of see what's going on. And some of these graphs might be a little bit hard to see, so you might want to go to the book to sort of look through them. I'll do my best in walking us through these graphs here. Okay, so when we think about causes of inflation, we want to think about our business cycle model, right? And so we've got this sort of complicated vertical triptych type thing where we've got our wage setting model on the top, we've got our Phillips curve here in the middle, and we've got our aggregate demand model, Keynesian cross model on the bottom. Now, what are we doing here? Well, we're sort of assuming that just output is equal to employment. Now, we know that that's not true, right? We know productivity is not equal to 1, but we're just setting productivity equal to 1. We're ignoring physical capital, technology, human capital, so that we can sort of put these all on top of each other so that their horizontal axes are all the same. And basically what that means is that our equilibriums then are all going to be lined up, right? So we have our equilibrium from the wage setting, price setting model where there's no pressure on wages or prices. That means that we're at the point in the Phillips curve where inflation is equal to expected inflation, right? In this model, in this graph, it's 3%. And that means that our aggregate demand is equal to how much we produce, and so we are at an equilibrium there as well. So then let's think about what happens when we get a shock, right? And in this case, we're going to assume we get a negative shock. And so if we work from the bottom up, right, then our aggregate demand shifts down because it could be any number of reasons. It could be because consumers decide to save more and spend less. It could be because firms invest less. Government has to cut government spending. And so we get a shift down to point C. That means a lower output. That means lower employment and higher unemployment, right? So that now our price setting curve is above our wage setting curve. That means we have a negative bargaining gap, and we move down our Phillips curve to point C, where inflation now is less than expected inflation, where it's 2% now, 3 minus 1 being 2%. So now note a couple of things, right? The way we sort of graph this is in the bottom, we get a shift down in our aggregate demand. But that's the only curve we kind of shift here. We move down our wage setting curve to C. They always put the point on the price setting curve. I don't know. I would put it on the wage setting curve. Doesn't matter. That gives us our negative bargaining gap, and then we move down our Phillips curve. Now, we're only going to get a shift in the Phillips curve when we get a change in like expected inflation. And so we'll see that as well. All right. So if we get, for example, a fall in planned investment, right, and it sort of stays low, then what's going to happen? Well, we're going to get a shift down initially in our aggregate demand curve. That's going to lead to a negative bargaining gap, lower inflation. If it stays there, right, then expected inflation will decrease, and that will shift down our Phillips curve. So if we stay at this point, right, then that means that we're going to have lower and lower inflation, and we could eventually get deflation, right? If this shifted one more time, then we could actually get deflation. And so when we are at an equilibrium where output is less than our supply side equilibrium, employment is less than our supply side equilibrium, unemployment is greater than our supply side equilibrium, then we really want to do what we can in order to increase aggregate demand back up to our equilibrium. Otherwise, it ends up with higher unemployment and eventually deflation. And so in our next chapters, we're going to start talking about policies that can help shift us back to that equilibrium. Now, all right, so let's think about some other potential policies, right? One being an increased market power of firms, meaning that they can increase their markup. This could be because of mergers, so there's less competition. It could also be because of protectionist policies, right? Increased tariffs, for example, or quotas about how much you can import, and that would increase the price setting curve. And so what's going to happen, right, is that our price setting curve shifts down. Remember, a higher markup decreases the price setting curve. And we're going to go from A to C. But at A, basically, A is saying, all right, well, if we stay at A, then we have a positive bargaining gap. And so if we stay at that sort of initial level of employment and unemployment, then we're just going to get shifts up in our Phillips curve. So we don't want that, right? We want, that's just going to be higher and higher inflation. So you can see inflation is 3% at A, 5% at D, and 7% at E because of that 2% bargaining gap. And so really what's going to need to happen in order to keep inflation at that 3% is an eventual adjustment to the higher unemployment rate. So this is basically saying that reduced competition or increased market power for firms is either going to end up with higher unemployment rate at our new supply side equilibrium or higher and increasing inflation. And so it's one of the reasons, one of the arguments against increased market power, whether that's from mergers and acquisitions or from protectionist policies that reduce competition with foreign firms. Similarly, right, we could have increased union bargaining power. And as we talked about in Chapter 2, one potential result of increased union bargaining power is a shift up in the in the wage setting curve. And again, either that's going to mean a bargaining gap, a positive bargaining gap that shifts up the Phillips curve over time, and so we get higher and higher inflation, or it's going to mean we end up at a higher unemployment rate at our supply side equilibrium. Right now, we talked about a couple of reasons that might not be true, right? We talked about sort of the voice effect. It could also be that unions increase productivity. So there's some potential reasons why this might not be the case, but on the other hand, if it does shift up the wage setting curve and shift up labor's bargaining power, then either higher inflation or a higher unemployment rate is the result. So if we think about causes of inflation, right, we can sort of think about inflation occurring for one of two reasons, right? So one could be a demand shock. So people want to buy more. Now that could be a number of reasons, right? It could be that consumers are optimistic. They want to buy more. It could be firms are like, oh, there's a new technology we need to invest in, and so they buy more. It could be that the government needs to buy more because they're worried about a war. But that will introduce a bargaining gap, and that will raise inflation. The other potential cause of inflation is on the supply side, right? And so the supply side can either shift up the price setting curve, shift down the price setting curve or shift up the wage setting curve. And in those cases, we can get higher inflation if we don't adjust to that new sort of supply side equilibrium. So one potential supply side shock is when there's a change to an important price in the economy. So often that price has been oil. And so we can see real oil prices on a ratio scale or log scale on the right in red, and changes in the NAIRU or that supply side unemployment rate in green, and then our inflation rate in blue. And so you can see we've had sort of increases in the inflation rate related to increases in the price of oil. But one thing to note, right, is that we had a big increase in the price of oil in the 2000s here, sort of in the 90s and 2000s, and we did not get that same increase in inflation. And part of the reason is that oil became less important in the economy, partly because the economy grew, partly because we found other energy sources, and partly because we became much more efficient in our use of oil. So oil is still an important piece of the economy, as is natural gas, but it's less important than it used to be. So we can see why we might get, with our wage setting, price setting model, we can see how an increase in the price of oil, right, can lead to, higher unemployment, higher structural unemployment, which is something we saw in the 1970s, and a higher price level, right, because we get that shock, and potentially rising inflation, right? So the key is if that initial increase in the price of oil leads to higher inflation, and we don't adjust to that new supply side equilibrium, then higher inflation leads to higher expected inflation, and then that leads to more inflation. So that's kind of what we saw, right? Inflation had started in the United States, it started creeping up in the sort of second half of the 1960s, and then continued to increase throughout the 1970s, partly driven by these increases in the price of oil. And so this is, we've already really seen this graph, but here the decrease in the price setting curve moving from A to C is caused by the higher oil price. And then if we try to stay at this level, this initial level of employment and unemployment, we just get a shift up in the Phillips curve. And so that's kind of what was going on, is that, we'll sort of talk about this when we talk about monetary and fiscal policy, but we were trying to keep the unemployment rate sort of where it was, and that led to higher and higher inflation in the 1970s, until, we decided, okay, we have to get rid of inflation, and we increased interest rates a lot in the late 70s and early 80s, and that led to a sharp recession. That led to lower inflation, lower expected inflation, and we eventually settled in at a new supply side equilibrium. So we can sort of divide up our causes of inflation into a few categories, right? So one is that cost push inflation, right? And so that's like an increase in the price of oil, or an increase in any sort of important price in the economy, including wages, right? So if wages go up, we'll get that cost push inflation because firms' costs go up and therefore their prices go up. Demand pull inflation, right, is sort of a movement along the Phillips curve due to changes in aggregate demand. And so an increase in aggregate demand leads to an increase in inflation. A decrease in aggregate demand leads to a decrease in inflation. But we're just moving along that Phillips curve. And then the expectations-driven inflation is all about changes in expected inflation. And it can come really from either cost push inflation or demand pull inflation if we don't return to our supply side equilibrium, right? So if we have a year or 2 or 3 or 4 years of higher inflation and people start expecting it, then we end up with, a self-fulfilling prophecy where we end up with higher inflation just because people expect it. And then that can be really difficult because now you have to change those expectations, and you may need to, cause a recession in order to reduce inflation. We can also have potentially profit push or seller's inflation, right? And this is really about sort of a decrease in competition. And so if there is a decrease in competition, so in this case, we have less competition going along the horizontal axis and the markup on the vertical axis. And in this case, if there's less competition, then that markup increases, right? So that pushes the price setting curve down, and that can open up a bargaining gap and lead to higher inflation. And so whenever we have inflation, there's always some debate, right, about what is causing it. Is it, did some major price change in the economy? Is it just due to change in aggregate demand? Is it due to firms' decreased competition and they're increasing their profits? Um, and it can sometimes take a while looking at the economic data to sort of see what was going on, right? If it's profit push or seller's inflation, then we would expect to see higher profit levels along with higher inflation, right? Whereas that's not the case for the others where the markup stays basically the same. And so I think that's an important question. And one of the reasons that, we really want to encourage competition in the economy. If we don't, get good levels of competition, then that can increase the uh, markup, right? And that can then lead to higher prices. Um, and then, of course, it can also shift up our Phillips curve, right? And so then we end up, with even higher inflation than we would like. And so competition is really one of those ways that we can keep a damper on uh, prices in general and keep inflation from getting out of control. All right, so we talked about ways to measure inflation, right? The sort of most important one that we'll look at the most is the consumer price index. But we also talked about like the PCE for the GDP deflator. We looked at how nominal wages are related to real wages in our wage setting and price setting model, and then built the Phillips curve. And then talked about sort of how changes in aggregate demand, how changes in costs, how changes in markups can affect inflation, and then how the inflation can change expected inflation, and how that can be then a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so, one of the things that we'll talk about when we talk about monetary policy is the way that the central bank tries to keep inflation at that sort of low and stable, 2 to 2.5%. And so, in the next unit, we're going to introduce our main policies in macroeconomics, which are fiscal policy and monetary policy. We'll explain how those work in order to try to smooth out the business cycle. And then we'll explain how, we need different policies, whether they're demand shocks or supply shocks. And really, sort of monetary and fiscal policy are really both built to target demand shocks. And so when there's a supply shock like the pandemic, that can make things more difficult. And so we'll see that. And then we will sort of discuss more about fiscal policy and monetary policy in future chapters as well.